All right. Good afternoon or good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. I'm Matt Haller, President and CEO of the International Franchise Association. Really appreciate you spending a couple minutes with us this afternoon or this morning, wherever you are. We are delighted to bring a fireside chat, not a webinar, to our members to unpack the results of last week's epic elections and talk about what this means for IFA, for each of your businesses, and where the association, each of you can lean in going forward. So we have two of my favorite people joining me for this fireside chat, representing both sides of the political spectrum. I will start with Lori, ladies first, of course. Lori Denham is a partner at KDCR. She has more than 2 decades of policy and political experience, extensive experience working on Capitol Hill on a range of policy issues, including healthcare, tax, labor policy, trade. Prior to joining her firm, she spent nearly 5 years at another trade association, so knows our industry and our issues quite well. She was executive vice president at the Retail Industry Leaders Association, or RILA, as we like to call them in Washington parlance. Kevin Yoder, another good friend of IFA and franchising, is a partner at Venture Government Strategies. Kevin served 4 years in the U.S., 4 terms. I didn't mean to shortchange you, Kevin, in the U.S. Congress, representing the 3rd District of Kansas. And during his time in the House, he was a key and powerful member of the House Appropriations Committee and subcommittee chairman. He was constantly recognized for his work across the aisle, working with Republicans and Democrats to bring solutions to Kansas and the country. So both of you are key advisors to me and the IFA team. So thank you so much for joining us. So let's get into it. I think as we reflect on the outcome of this election during the program, we will talk about the whole new political landscape at the federal level. We are going to have another conversation either later this month or next, talk about what happened in the states, which is also significant, as everyone knows, and talk about how this new political and economic environment is going to impact franchising. So whether you're a franchisee, a franchisor, or a supplier, there's a lot that's going to change in the year ahead, and it's actually changing in real time. And I think we'll get into some of that in terms of leadership elections, which are happening right now as we all navigate Washington today, where President-elect Trump just met with current President Biden, and President-elect Trump was on Capitol Hill this morning for meetings with the House Republican Conference. So there's a lot of activity in Washington today, just down the road from where I am and where Kevin and Lori are. And this is going to be a great opportunity for anybody out there to ask us questions. So feel free to put them in the chat. We will kind of answer some in real time as they come in, and we'll save some others for the end, and looking forward to it. So let's start, obviously, at the presidential level. This is the map. President-elect Trump ended up with 312 electoral votes. Vice President Harris with 226. I just want to start with each of you. What were the surprises that you guys saw, and any particular things that jump out to each of you from the results at the presidential level? And maybe I'll start. Sadly, Lori, I'll start with the victors on this one. So we'll start with Kevin.
Well, I think the race had been predicted, polling wise, to be 50-50 going into the election night, and every pundit was saying it was too close to be called. And so I think the obvious first ones off the top are, of course, Trump, winning so decisively, winning the popular vote, winning all 7 swing states. I think there were very few that were predicting it, that amongst the public media, and so I think that was very surprising to Washington, D.C. I don't think folks knew who was going to win per se, but Trump winning so decisively, and look, he's the first Republican to win the popular vote in 20 years, and only the second since 1988. So over 36 years, only 2 Republicans have won the popular vote. It's the magnitude of the popular vote win too would take us all the way back to 88. So, there's a sense now in Washington and the country that, Trump won, and he won decisively, and he's got a mandate to govern. And I think if he had only won the Electoral College and not the popular vote, that would have been a different narrative here. So that I think that really was impactful. Um, there are other things that I think were really interesting just in terms of the demographic wins and those sorts of things we could probably get into. But I think just off the top, the size of the Trump win is really and the electoral winning all the swing states and the popular vote in particular, really a massive and people are calling it, he's called it the greatest political comeback in history. I mean, you'd have be hard to argue with that. He's only the second president to get elected after losing the presidency in American history. So a lot of historical significance there at the presidential night.
Yeah, I think one thing I've reflected on in the last week is just how little there is to debate and dispute here in the outcome. So I'm actually more interested in, I think a lot of our members who are on this webinar or this fireside chat are more interested in kind of what does this all mean going into 2025. But before we get there and talk about the House and the Senate, which will have, arguably create some limitations on what the administration can do, even with full Republican control. Lori, let's talk about some of those demographic changes, because I think clearly, Trump was able to reach and to deliver things that the campaign had speculated on and had said that, they were going to, add significant numbers of minority voters. Obviously, the Harris campaign and Democrats were banking on a big turnout amongst women. And I think we saw some changes or some limits to that approach. Can you just talk a little bit about the demographic changes and, kind of where maybe the Democratic Party is reflecting, as I know there was a conference meeting earlier this morning that maybe you have a little bit of insights on in terms of that discussion already?
Absolutely. And I think, the point made about President Trump winning the popular vote is certainly not lost on Democrats. I think notably, and there's been a lot of reporting on this, big shifts with the Latino vote in particular, but non-white voters more broadly who'd been core to Democrats delivering in elections shifted markedly toward Trump. You mentioned the gender gap. I think there was a lot of reporting leading up to the election about the big gender divide. And while it's still fairly pronounced among young voters in particular, that gap was much, much smaller than anticipated. Harris actually lost ground with younger voters compared to Biden in 2020. And I think if you look at the breadth of the win, much attention has been focused on the battleground states, which are obviously really important for the Electoral College count. But you saw Trump with significant upticks from 2020 in places in Democratic strongholds like California, Los Angeles, New York City, and then of course in Pennsylvania, which was the biggest battleground state. He picked up ground in the 5 heaviest leaning Democratic counties. So I think agree with the consensus that in previous elections, Democrats would have likely pointed to the popular vote, but in this case, the rebuke was pretty overwhelming and across a number of demographic groups. I know we'll talk more later about the House and the Senate. You saw this sort of uniquely play out at the presidential level, not as much, I think, in the congressional races.
Yeah, I think Leader Schumer is obviously very pleased. Obviously it's never good to lose the majority, but he was able to limit the gains in some key places like Wisconsin, Michigan, Nevada, Arizona that had been heavily targeted. And, I think we will talk about the Senate. Like, candidate recruitment is always so important. And I think it's, as much as you can tie yourself as a Republican to President-elect Trump, it's not automatic. It's not a slam dunk. And I think we've seen that in places, particularly like Arizona, with Kari Lake's outcome there, and some others where there was just not enough money or organization or profile with some of these Senate candidates on the Republican side who were trying to unseat, incumbents that were not overly popular by any stretch of the imagination, but had enough in the tank to outperform Trump.
You know, Matt,
So
Matt,
back,
can I just
yeah,
can
go
I
ahead,
just on
Kevin.
one
Yeah.
point on that? I think it was really an interesting observation there that in all these swing states where Republicans are trying to unseat uh, incumbent Democratic senators, our candidates ran behind Trump. And I think that's one of the interesting things about the Trump movement is that there are voters who just go to the polls and vote for Trump and either don't vote for anyone else or vote. These are Democratic converts. You know, they had the Reagan Democrats, the Trump Democrats, who maybe are still voting Democrat down the rest of the ballot. That delta is enough to, in a number of these swing states, make a difference. But it, you know, it wasn't even in just even our most prominent candidates. It was happening too. So it's a very prominent across the board issue for down ballot Republicans. They are not getting Trump votes, and I even in suburban districts where I saw there were candidates who didn't want Trump's endorsement because they thought it might bring them down. Trump exceeded them in some cases as well. So, right, that is a definite flip in how this election occurred.
Yeah, I mean the voter that votes for Donald Trump and Ruben Gallego in Arizona is
Right.
a bit of a head scratcher. And for those that aren't Arizona or political aficionados, I mean, he's been a House member for what, Lori, a decade probably, and probably one of the most liberal members of the House. And there were clearly significant numbers of people in Arizona that made that choice to either not vote in the Senate race or vote for somebody like Gallego.
Mhm.
And what message is that sending? I think it's a little unclear. Let's talk about economic issues, kind of big picture from the presidential level, because obviously they were major factors in Harris's inability to overcome kind of the sag of the dissatisfaction with President Biden. And while a lot of the so-called elites and economists have said, you know, or told voters the economy is really good, you should believe us. I think the fundamental point is inflation and the cost of living has not kept up with wage growth from what voters are feeling, even if the data says otherwise. And so, how do you guys think this factored into this new coalition that Trump was able to build? And then, I think more interesting for IFA and our members is, what do you think that's going to mean in terms of the agenda that the Trump White House and House and Senate Republicans and potentially Democrats working with them in any ways are going to pursue? I mean, I don't believe it's going to be a traditional, you know, Chamber of Commerce Republican type of agenda in this movement that the president has built. And Kevin, you and I have talked a lot about the power center moving from in the 2017 inauguration. Nobody was prepared at the Trump White House for enacting an economic agenda, and you know, documents and you know, legislative proposals were being pulled out of the archives of the House Ways and Means Committee and you know, other committees to try to get things done in an environment where it was like the dog that caught the car. And now that's different. So help our members understand how this is going to play out in the next 100 days from an economic agenda perspective.
You want me to go, or you want Lori to go?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, sure. Well, I think the coalition clearly is different, right? And Trump did not really make a ton of gains in the suburbs, but he made gains, as Lori pointed out, in a lot of different demographics that Republicans have done very poorly with. And so his share of the African-American vote, his share of the Latino vote, I mean, he won male Latino vote in America. He's got the largest share since they've been doing exit polling of any Republican. Winning, young people, certainly young male votes. And that coalition's different than Republicans have had in the past. And that's what led to a popular vote win. Trump's appeal is much more populist, right? His ability to talk about kitchen table issues in a way that other Republicans haven't been perceived to be as successful at. I think Democrats left a huge opening for Trump in that their work on inflation, just was never successful. And I think their effort to discount it for a long time, really, I think it came back to roost. Of course, when they moved forward on spending, a number of the big spending bills, they were warned by Democratic economists. Larry Summers famously saying, "Don't do this; you're going to cause inflation." And then they said, "Well, it's transitory." And then as they got into the election and people were still feeling the effects of inflation, even though it had gone down, their response was, the economy is really good. You don't really know how good it is. And that, I think, in my opinion, as the sort of Republican on this panel, I think that was a mistake, in that instead of sort of acknowledging the mistake they made, they just tried to convince voters that inflation had gone away and that the economy was really good. And they were not understanding how good it was, right? And that doesn't really work with voters to try to explain away their problems. And so as they move into this new administration and this new sort of coalition they built, yeah, I mean, that's going to play itself out in terms of policy, or if it doesn't, it's going to disrupt the coalition pretty quickly. I think that's an open question as to how a second Trump administration governs. You know, he's obviously talking a lot about tariffs and onshoring jobs and, you know, bringing work back to the United States as sort of a focus. And so I think you'll see that there. But how does it play itself out in tax policy? You know, we saw Trump on the campaign trail talk about, you know, no tax on tips and no tax on overtime and no tax on Social Security, and it's going to become a very expensive tax bill if that of all those promises are able to come to fruition. And then what part do they end up paying for it with? And some of the folks that have gone to the Democrats that used to be Republicans are suburban voters, right? And so are their tax policies is their wish list on the chopping block in exchange for more populist, you know, working class tax policy? So I think we don't know the answer, but we know what Trump said on the trail. The question will be when they start governing. There's a little bit of a mixed match, and Matt, you mentioned the House and how it was in 2017. I think one other interesting factor is in 2017 when Trump won, it was a total surprise. No one expected it, and really no one owed their careers to Donald Trump. Now there are members in the House and Senate that got elected because of Trump and Trump's endorsement and Trump's engagement. And so, whereas in 2017, Paul Ryan and Kevin Brady wrote the tax bill, you could see the White House having a much heavier hand here in how this all happens, because you know, there are members there who I think will follow the White House's lead more than, say, Paul Ryan would have in 2017.
Yeah, great points, and definitely something that we're going to all be navigating as White House staff and agency officials become named here in the coming days and weeks. So, Lori, why don't you reflect maybe a little bit on just kind of Kevin's analysis there? Feel free to, you know, disagree with it, poke holes in it, and then I'd also be curious in, you know, how are Democrats thinking about what happened, and are there opportunities that Democrats are seeing? Like, are they going to be just trying to disrupt Trump's economic agenda because it's Trump, or are there, because the Republicans have taken some of these issues that have maybe traditionally been, or voters that have traditionally been in the Democratic camp, are there opportunities to try to work with a Trump economic agenda, recognizing there's going to be lots of things that they'll disagree with this administration on?
Yeah, I think broadly speaking, it's really clear from the exit polls and the voter turnout that the economy was the driving issue, and pocketbook issues versus macroeconomic principles, right? I think there's also, when thinking about it from an IFA and advocacy perspective, I think there's a notable sort of anti-elitist messaging that resonated, and whether, you know, it's Wall Street versus Main Street, CEOs versus, you know, the workers or the regional, you know, heads of office. I think differentiating between, you know, endorsements by the leading newspapers in the country versus, you know, the leading folks on social media platforms, those were all things that I think Democrats largely missed in this election. And despite attempts to catch up, I think, to what Trump world has traditionally done very well, they did rely on sort of those elite validators around economic policy issues, which when people were not feeling that themselves, it didn't resonate, and it didn't reflect what they were seeing in their own homes and amongst their communities. So I think that's a big takeaway, that Democrats, as the party who argues they're, you know, advocating for working men and women, are really going to be grappling with it and struggling with and coming to terms with over the next months and years, frankly. I think when it comes to how Democrats will work with Trump, I think you've already seen a number of his biggest critics who are, use Adam Schiff as an example, House member from California, newly elected senator from California, led impeachment efforts against President Trump, has said he plans to work with the president. Whether the president will want to work with him or not is a different story. But I do think that when push comes to shove, Democrats want government to work and want to make progress on economic policy issues. Do I think that there will be a huge incentive, particularly in the House, to work against the House majority Republicans and block progress? Absolutely. They're already looking ahead to the midterm election. That being said, you know, the members who are the so-called majority makers from these districts where they outperformed Harris, they did it because they were talking about economic issues and pocketbook, home, you know, issues that are affecting families every day, not in elitist terms, but in terms that really were important to those key demographics in their individual districts. So I think on a number of issues, whether it's family leave or other issues in the economic policy space, there will be Democrats willing to work with Republicans and work with the president. I think there are other areas, particularly around taxes, that are going to be done on a more partisan basis, where there's going to be less of an incentive to do so.
Yeah, I think we're already seeing that. Like you said, Lori, you talked about the Schiff example. A member tell me that Senator Fetterman from Pennsylvania has already come out and supported Senator Rubio for Secretary of State, even though he hasn't been formally nominated. And then, you know, as another example, new House member Kristen McDonald-Rivet from Michigan was at an event we hosted this morning up on Capitol Hill, the IFA team, and she was telling us that, you know, her final ad that she cut, I mean, she was at a bar with a beer talking about, you know, economic issues, not talking about, you know, any of the social stuff. And she said, you know, I'm here to come to Washington to stop the BS and get stuff done. And sort of that make, you know, very, and she's in a Republican, I think +7 or +9 district. So that Trump won. So it's clear there's going to be Democrats that want to work on things that Republicans were able to address more smartly, I think, in this election. So let's go to the next slide, Anna, and get into the Senate. Obviously, Republicans are going to have a 53 set to 47 majority, and there's going to be a lot of change in the Republican Party, as we talked about. But there was a lot of speculation over the last couple of weeks, and really even more so in the last 48 hours, about what would happen with Leader McConnell choosing to end on his own terms his run as Senate Majority Leader. And we have some breaking news here that we're going to do on this fireside chat, and I will give it to Congressman Yoder to provide some insights into the new Senate Majority Leader.
Happy to do the honors here. So this morning there were 3 candidates who ran for Senate Majority Leader in the 119th Congress. Senator Rick Scott from Florida, Senator John Cornyn from Texas, and Senator John Thune from South Dakota. A lot of MAGA Trump sort of pressure for senators to vote for Rick Scott. You saw Elon Musk endorse him, and Tucker Carlson, and a lot of that crew. And they voted this morning, 2 rounds. The first round was, I can actually tell you the exact vote. The first round was John Thune, 23, John Cornyn, 15, Rick Scott, 13. And so what happens then is the lowest candidate then drops off. So Cornyn was at 15, Scott was at 13, Scott dropped off. And then in the final vote, Thune was elected the new majority leader, 29 to 24. So John Thune will be the new majority leader of the incoming Senate.
Well, they were all three great choices for franchising, and not something that we play a role in leadership elections. They're all, big supporters of our business model, and will be great senators to continue to work with moving forward. But what do you make of this? Because there's a lot of senators, there's a lot of politicians that sort of reinvent themselves depending on the way the political winds blow. But Thune is not has been criticized, President Trump in the past, and is probably viewed of the three as the least kind of aligned, or at least MAGA at least. But he's probably the most well liked of the group. So is it as simple as that, Kevin? I mean, you've been in these rooms in the House where decisions are made without recorded votes, and just give us a little color on Thune and what you make of where the Republican Senate caucus wants to go to help enact President Trump's agenda.
Yeah, it is secret ballot, right? So we may not know how most of the senators voted. Some of them publicly stated how they were going to vote. Some of them, there will state now. There may be a lot of Thune stated votes here now that he's the new leader, and of course, the leader will help direct what committees people go to and the agenda, and it's a very powerful position in the Senate. And so, people will want to be in good stead, I assume, with the new leader. But again, it is a secret vote, and I think ultimately these things are relationship driven. At the end of the day, some of it is ideological. There were certainly a number of members who wanted Senator Scott because they thought he would be more disruptive to the sort of current operations of the Senate. He would be more of a change agent. And Thune and Cornyn had detractors on both sides, some, arguing whether they were sufficiently enough MAGA or sufficiently conservative enough. But I think at the end of the day, senators really didn't, they were very resistant to the outside pressure, and they wanted to make sure that this is a Senate driven process and that, it will be relationship driven. And look, yes, you have now President Trump and you have a leader in place that's going to be carrying out that agenda. Senator Thune, I think now Leader Thune, did a lot of work over the past year or so to mend fences with President Trump and to make sure that they were in a good position. And so I think Trump never weighed in. Trump didn't take a position. And I think partly because he knew that if he picked the wrong candidate, it would obviously be disruptive to that relationship from the beginning. And I think he wanted to see where the Senate went and then get on, and be a teammate with that. But I do think it'll be difficult job to be a leader when there is a lot of reform that's going to be coming out of the White House. And some of that reform is going to require legislative action. That legislative action requires 60 votes in the Senate, unless it can be done by reconciliation, which you all know is a budget process where only 51 senators are required. But for most policies, it requires 60 votes. And that means with 53 Republicans we see here, that means it's going to require 7 Democrats to govern. And that's the kind of cooling saucer of policy. The House can pass the Trump agenda, but there's going to need to be 7 Democrats involved. I do think that the president will begin to put pressure on the Senate to eliminate the filibuster. We saw President Biden do that. We saw Democrats come within 2 votes of getting rid of the filibuster in the last Senate. But for Senators Manchin and Sinema, the filibuster would be gone. And I'm sure Democrats might be regretting that decision, with Republicans holding, all the levers now. So we'll see what happens. I don't think they will do that. But I think there'll be a lot of pressure to say, why are we allowing these 7 Democrats to veto the Trump agenda?
Well, that's great insight. And I do agree with you. There's gonna be a lot of outside pressure from the online MAGA movement to do what needs to be done to change the system and make the case that this is what the American people voted for, to your point about a mandate. But Lori, talking about the Senate and the Senate Democratic side of things, it doesn't seem like there's going to be any change in the Democratic leadership in the Senate. But where do you see Democrats potentially in the Senate working with Republicans? What issue areas do you see? I mean, there's a lot of regulations that could get addressed via the Congressional Review Act, including things that impact our members in the franchise model. that we've pursued in this Congress with bipartisan support. So maybe some thoughts on the policy side, and then just on maybe a few individual senators that you in particular might see as so-called gettable to work with on some of the business community's agenda and IFA's agenda.
Absolutely. I think policy-wise, the newly re-elected president really does sort of create a number of new opportunities for Democratic senators in particular to cut deals and be aligned. I think you saw that on a limited basis, but on some key policy issues during his first term. Again, more broadly speaking, I think the initial days of this Congress are likely to be fairly partisan, especially with a reconciliation process and the tax policy issues driving that broader conversation. I do think while you won't have Democratic support for a broader reconciliation package, when it comes to some discrete tax issues, I could see some crossover and some support, albeit not resulting in votes for the package. I also think, and I touched on this a little bit earlier, if you look back to the first Trump term and areas around some of the workforce issues, whether it's, I know the overtime rule, for example, is set to go into effect January 1. That's going to be different than what the first term of the Trump administration, where he was able to walk back the overtime rule. I think while there aren't going to be a lot of Democrats raising their hand enthusiastically to walk that back, I do think that the focus on the economic policy issues, and again, sort of the Main Street versus Wall Street perspective, is going to be something that a number of senators will take into account. You mentioned someone like a John Fetterman, who does have a more populist orientation. I think he's somebody who, is certainly going to be open. And then I would also point to someone like a John Hickenlooper from Colorado, who's much more moderate. You're not going to have, a Joe Manchin or a Kyrsten Sinema necessarily, who are throwing their body in front of the train, but Democrats aren't driving the train at this point. And so also looking ahead to the next class of senators who are up for re-election, again, Hickenlooper sort of rises to the top of that list for me. He's someone I know IFA has had a really good working relationship with. And I think there are a number of newer senators coming over from the House side who, may have had a pretty left of center to left agenda as sitting House members from very safe Democratic districts. When you come to the Senate, a lot of those members tend to moderate. And so even someone like Ruben Gallego, who you mentioned as, focused on pretty progressive agenda in the House, he won the Arizona Senate race, not just talking about pocketbook issues, but talking about border issues and keeping a secure border, and really meeting sort of Latino voters and working class Latino voters where they were. And so that crossover vote in states like Arizona, where you've got a significant demographic voting for Trump and voting for someone like Ruben Gallego, he's not going to be up for re-election for 6 years. But I do think there's going to be an incentive for him and his fellow senator from Arizona, Senator Kelly, to look for opportunities to, sort of port those crossover voters and work with the administration on not just economic issues, but border issues as well.
Yeah, thanks, Lori. Those are great names and a good opportunity for me to remind everybody that IFA has a long track record and a stellar reputation working both sides of the aisle. And we were recently given an award for being the most bipartisan trade association in Washington, D.C. So that's something we're proud of and will certainly continue. even in an environment where Republicans maintain full control at the federal level. We've got a few questions that have come. Yeah, please,
could I
Kevin.
make one quick point? And there
Sure.
may be audible groans across the room here if we bring this up, but the 2026 elections are right around the corner, and so that will heavily impact.
Please don't ask anybody for money or play a TV ad.
Right.
It's not the time for that.
Exactly.
No,
But they'll heavily impact the dynamics in the Senate. And of course, Democrats will be trying to advance and win back the 4 seats they need. They're going to be looking at, Susan Collins is up in 26. They made a really hard push against her. This will be Trump's midterm. Now, Trump actually picked up Senate seats in his midterm in 2018. If you remember, he got Missouri and there were a number of others that he had picked up, maybe North Dakota and some. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. But North Carolina will be another one. You have Tom Tillis up for reelection. That's a very close state. But you have Susan Collins in a Democratic in a Kamala Harris state, and then you also have a couple of Democrats in difficult situations. You have John Ossoff, who's in Georgia. That's a Republican state. That will come up as well. Gary Peters is in a Republican state now, technically with Michigan going for Trump. And so just laying those factors out, to Lori's point about who may be interested in running, is just those seats will be up for grabs, and that'll focus the candidates more so if they're on the ballot in 26.
Absolutely. Great points. And the parlor game is already beginning about who's going to stay and who's going to go. Several of those names have been in the rumor mill for a while about if they're going to even seek another term, which open seats create some other dynamics as we saw this cycle too. All right, I want to answer a couple questions before we talk about the House and the IFA's policy agenda and our top priorities going into 2025. So first question here is specific from it's really about regulations, and President-elect Trump is pushing for fewer regulations and really eliminating lots of regulations. This question is particularly focused on the EPA, but what do you guys both think that how is the regulatory rollback agenda going to play out, and when and what role will Congress have vis-a-vis doing this through the administration?
I can start. I think it'll be aggressive, very aggressive, more aggressive than last time. I think they've been licking their chops for the last 4 years to get back in there and finish the job. I think, generally there's going to be a lot of, attempts to rein in the bureaucracy in all different forms. And we've heard that, OPM is going to order federal employees to come back to the office. Right. You're going to have just bureaucracy put on notice that if they're not on board with the Trump agenda, that, there's going to be attempts to have those people, removed because they're not, on board with what the president wants to try to accomplish. And last time there was a lot of frustration that the quote unquote deep state, attempted to disrupt what were, the administration's agenda items. So I just lay that construct there to say that the bureaucracy will be, I think, heavily reformed, and that will include a lot of regulations that they'll try to, remove from the books. I think Trump said on the campaign trail some very large numbers, like, for every, what was it, 10 that, we remove, we can put one more on. I think the number got even bigger. So I think there'll be efforts there. Congress does have, Matt, you mentioned the Congressional Review Act earlier. That is a tool, but it can only go back, I think, is it 6 months look back. Yeah. So, and I actually heard an incoming member the other day say that they ought to make the CRA look back be much longer. And that would be a reform idea that Congress might look at as something they could do. Again, that would take 60 votes in the Senate to accomplish a reform like that. But so they're fairly limited on what Congress can do, other than Congress can pass statutes, right? But the point about the CRA, right, is it doesn't require 60 votes in the Senate. It requires 51 votes in the Senate. So I think that will be a tool that they'll use as much as they can on that 6-month look back. And then, I think you'll have a lot of rulemaking and regulatory change. What we'll want to do, of course, is, particularly as it involves our key issues, is figure out what are there solutions that might stand the test of time. We don't want to be in this scenario where every 4 years we're having to then, when a new president comes in, they just undo what we got done on joint employer, for example. And so, I think we'll want to, be looking at ways in which, we can thread needles and, whether it's the FTC with the franchise rule and coming up with solutions that might be less tantalizing for a new Democratic administration to try to reverse immediately.
Yeah, and I think, Lori, go ahead. I think that I'll just make a point that is why being bipartisan on our issues is so important, because no matter who's in charge, we need to have this sort of franchising is bipartisan or nonpartisan as much as possible, so we can try to build the case to both parties in an environment where it's likely not going to be able to be something that can be addressed without getting 60 votes. Lori, please jump in on the regulation question.
No, I agree with you completely in terms of the importance on the bipartisan approach IFA has taken. You've had some great success in this Congress and with the divided government. So I think that speaks to the strategy working, and albeit while the next 2 years will be single party control, I would put a little asterisk up there, just given how narrow the House margin is going to be again. I'd also note that, and certainly would echo, I think our Republicans at the firm are hearing the same thing in terms of the regulatory rollback and sort of I think last time it was for every new regulation, you had to take 2 off the books, and yes, 10, 20, however many are going to come off the books now. I would note, though, that similar to what we saw when Trump left office in 2020, where you saw a flurry of regulations sort of getting pushed out in the last days of the administration post-election, we are hearing of similar efforts from the Biden administration. I think you'll see a lot of money go out the door around a number of their key policy accomplishments, whether those are around the Inflation Reduction Act or around the infrastructure bill. But I know just having looked at sort of the regulatory dashboard yesterday, you've got about 70 rules across the agencies that are already at the final rule stage, sort of sitting at the White House for final sign-off. And so you could see some gumming up of the works, if you will, essentially flooding the zone in certain regulatory areas. EPA, I know there were a handful in the EPA space, not as many for the Department of Labor, as you might expect, but also a number in the healthcare HHS employer space. So would flag that as something that will create work for Republicans to either rewrite or roll back in the next 2 years.
Thanks, Lori. Yeah, and we'll be monitoring closely a lot of those in the coming weeks towards the end of the Biden administration, particularly at the FTC, where the request for information period is closed, and it's remained very murky what the commission may do around that investigation, if they will issue anything further. It is probably unlikely, given the time frame and limited staff capacity, along with other priorities there. But certainly something that we're going to keep a close eye on in the final days of the administration. All right, let's talk about the House, and then we can talk about the IFA's agenda and where we go from here. So it's not officially been called yet, but it is essentially a fait accompli at this point that Republicans will maintain the slimmest of House majorities. Although with some of the nominations that President-elect Trump has put forward already from the House, he is quickly potentially making forthcoming Speaker Johnson's job even more difficult than it already is, keeping that group together on issues. So you guys are both experts in the House. Let me just let you guys sort of opine on, how's this going to work in the House, which is where, by the way, any of this reconciliation agenda on tax reform, extending the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act issues needs to begin.
Well, I don't think it will go smoothly at all times. I think it might go more smoothly than the current Congress, although everything could go more smoothly than the current Congress. But just because now that they're all the levers there, you're playing with live fire. And if you're not moving the legislation, you now have to answer to the White House. You now have to answer to President Trump. You could certainly see him using the bully pulpit to bring in members. I talked to someone on the whip team the other day that said that President Trump's really now the chief whip of the House, because he can, and no slight to the people there, they were the ones saying it, that do it, that like ultimately when it comes down to the last guy or gal, they can go to the White House and have them really, turn the screws. So I think that will help. That being said, it's, when we did tax reform in 2017, just knowing that's going to be like the main legislative issue early on, we spent months on it in breakout sessions, and it was challenging, and there were lots of issues that would come up and you had to deal with them. Now that say 3 people or 4 people can thwart the entire bill, their issues have to be dealt with. And whether that means they don't like something that's in the bill on ideological grounds, right? Or they want something that's unique to their region, or, of course, salt, all those things, that could be a hard puzzle to put together. I think harder than it is being sort of described in the media. Like they're going to go in 90 days, they're going to bang out this beautiful bill. With those margins, there's a lot of kings now that suddenly can have their wish list in front of the speaker. So I think that'll be a challenge. The rules were a challenge last time, just getting rules passed. If we go down that road again, that could be a real problem. Again, I think those things will be smoothed out some because it's dealing with the president's agenda, and the president has a popular vote mandate, and he can use that bully pulpit, I think, more effectively. But look, some of these members are going to be in tough districts coming to reelection. To bring up 26, that's what members are going to, have in the back of their minds, that what planks are they walking on behalf of this administration that might be difficult in their reelection, right? So if you're talking border issues and things that, those could be challenges in some of these swing districts. If they go so hard that you get a backlash in a midterm from more moderate voters. And so you could see a few moderates here and there thwarting something that was coming forward. So I think it'll be a challenge. And I'm sure Lori will say, Democrats are going to be there licking their chops and looking at, all these races that are coming down to just a few thousand votes. How are those races going to be in 26 when Trump's not on the ballot? And people who Democrats who are upset with this result are very motivated to vote, and Republicans aren't as motivated because they're in power.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. And just before Lori addresses that, I'll just note for the group, Lori's team did some quick research for us over the last couple of days. It looks like 41% of U.S. senators and 55% of House members were literally not in Congress in 2017 when the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was passed. So more than half of the entirety of the House and the Senate was not in Congress. So the amount of education that needs to be done, as well as the compressed time frame that some have put forward to do this potentially as soon as tax day in April, is a monumental undertaking, given particularly the narrow margins that Kevin described that Republicans will be faced with.
Hey, Matt, can
Lori,
I add
your
one
thoughts
more
on?
add more
Please.
one more to Lori's great stats there? Is I had heard earlier today actually that there are only 5 members, Republicans, on Ways and Means that were on Ways and Means when TCJA went through.
And interestingly, every Democrat who will be on the Ways and Means Committee was on the Ways and Means Committee when TCJA passed. So despite the turnover, the Ways and Means Committee on the Dem side at least sort of has at least that experience under their belt. One place I think that is going a little underreported by the press in terms of comparing what this Congress and how the House is going to operate in 2025 versus 2017 is on the Democratic side, which is, while the margins, are different and certainly closer than they were in 2017, Democrats also have an entirely different leadership team from what the trio of top Democrats who were leading the House in 2017, and notably, love her or hate her, which I'm sure people on this call have very strong opinions, Nancy Pelosi will not be leading and is not leading currently the House Democratic Caucus. So you've got Hakeem Jeffries, Catherine Clark, and Pete Aguilar, all of whom were elected to lead House Democrats in this Congress. This will be their first time in leading the House Democratic Caucus with a Republican Senate and a Republican White House. And, navigating those dynamics is going to be new for that leadership team. You certainly have some of the members of the previous team around, but they're not the ones calling the shots. So I think while there's going to obviously be a lag time on the Republican side, and things always take longer in Congress, no matter who's in charge, to get over the finish line. I think that learning curve for the House Democratic leadership team on how to navigate single party control in the minority is going to be one to watch. I think they're all battle tested. It was a really, despite not flipping the House, it was a good night for incumbents with, I think, fewer flips for both parties. And so while you'll see a number of new members coming to the House, a lot of those members are from retirements or members who ran for other office, and fewer flips on both sides than people expected.
Thanks so much, Lori. Also great insights there. Okay, a couple quick questions before we get into our agenda in the last 7 minutes here that came in. Have we heard who Trump is nominating for DOL, the Department of Labor? No, there's a lot of rumors as there are with all these positions. A couple names that I've heard floated are his first nominee to the Labor Department, Andy Puzder, who is somebody very involved in the franchise community and known to many of us. Pat Pizzilla, who was the deputy secretary for most of the Trump administration's first term. His name has been floated as well. Those are the two that have been widely reported. There's some other names that have been bandied about. I will just note that in the first term of the Trump administration, the labor nominee did not even get named until the second week of December. And Andy ultimately resigned from the nomination in February. So it may be some time for some of these, but as we also talked about, there's a lot more work that's been done in preparation for some of these positions. So I actually think that we will know sooner rather than later, probably by Thanksgiving, most of these cabinet level positions, who the nominees are. And the Senate can begin confirming even before Inauguration Day. So they can begin confirming right when they get sworn in the first week of January. Okay, the last question that came in, well, here's a great question on the future of the joint employer rules. Look, it's a little complex, but currently the rule is not in effect, the Biden rule, because of the ruling of the federal courts in Texas. And so short of the current NLRB attempting to enact a new rule or instituting a new rule via a case law decision in the final days, this is kind of Lori's point about some of these potential midnight regulations that could be pursued, or changing the joint employer standard via a case law, which was what was done during the Obama administration. Joint employer policy is in a really good place for the franchise community and the direct control standards in place. Now, pivoting to our priorities for the future for 2025, look, the number one priority is going to be attempting to find certainty on joint employer policy, so we don't have this constant seesawing that we've had for the last decade. And the majority of the trifecta of Republicans plus a bipartisan group of Democrats presents an opportunity for us to potentially do something legislatively on the joint employer issue. So that is going to be probably the number one priority for the IFA as we move into 2025. The next question is, what happens to the FTC's review of the franchise rule, which Kevin touched on a little bit ago. We've had this RFI, request for information, looking at the franchise relationship along with other workforce related issues in the model hanging over us for the last 9 months or so at the FTC, and the franchise rule has gone unaddressed for well beyond its review period. We've put forward a policy solution to the FTC that has the support of state regulators, of the IFA, of many in the franchisee bar, and a broader coalition of the business community, not to mention a big bipartisan coalition on Capitol Hill that is instructing the FTC to focus on updating the rule, modernizing it, and reform it to bring it into the modern era. I mean, I was just watching a comment from the Restaurant Finance Development Conference that's occurring in Vegas right now. And there's a discussion with Greg Flynn, one of our board members, and Greg is talking about he doesn't read FTDs because they're so useless to franchisees. This is something that IFA has been clamoring for, that our brands know, that franchisees know, that state regulators know need to be modernized. This is an opportunity for the FTC working with industry to update and modernize a rule that we actually support and just need to bring into the modern era. So that's going to be a big priority for the IFA as well. And I think something that we can work closely with the FTC, which will likely have new leadership, although that's not guaranteed. In terms of our third priority, I would say it is ensuring that anything that's done on policy issues broadly is done without any sort of discriminatory treatment to the franchise business model. Now, I don't think that's something we have to worry about at the federal level in this environment, but it is definitely something that we've been very focused on at the state and local level in places like California, in some place like Minneapolis. But there may be opportunities to drive home that message at a federal level through some of the opportunities that present themselves in this type of a government. And I think sort of on top of all of that, we got to tell our story. And our story is something that drives home that franchising is bipartisan. It's something that it needs to be supported by members of both parties. And that's going to position us no matter what happens with these narrow margins in the House, with all the changes that are likely to happen in the Senate, with the forthcoming midterms. So that, I think, is something that we are very focused on, and that's something where each of you can play a really impactful role in. We've got a few other questions. I can go a little bit longer if we want to take a few of these. If Lori or Kevin need to drop, you are, of course, welcome to. I know you have other clients that may need you in places today. Do you guys want to sort of add anything to the IFA priorities or how you see them playing out before I address a few of these?
Other than to reiterate, I think the point that Lori made so well about the bipartisan efforts that IFA really will work on all of those to get them across the aisle. We had that event today. Democrats were there this morning. It's frustrating, I think, that we don't have more Democratic support in Congress. And so it would be easy to sort of ignore that right now when we have everything. And it's actually a really good opportunity to build that up and to create these long-lasting solutions. So I think you've laid out the agenda very well. Our job is to really to help support you and the rest of your consultants and to support the broad coalition we need to build, because this is such a bipartisan result in everyone's district. The story of individuals being able to create a business and realize the American dream. And I think that story, as we continue to build with your leadership, Matt, and the other members here, will, I think, create those longer solutions we need.
I completely agree. And I think the job and the work you did in this Congress, cultivating a number of those Democratic champions who not just go to the mat on votes, but are willing to talk to their own colleagues about this. I think the environment in the next Congress is only going to be more favorable to IFA, with Democrats who are doing some soul searching around the economic policy agenda and how we talk to voters and connect in our districts on issues that are pocketbook issues. And so I think IFA has already laid a lot of that groundwork, and now it's about continuing to expand our base of support when conditions are going to be hopefully improved for us in this next Congress.
Yeah, thanks, Lori. Thanks, Kevin. So quickly, there was a question about the overtime rule, which Lori had touched on as something that's not gone into effect yet. IFA has sued the Department of Labor along with a large coalition of business groups. That lawsuit is currently pending in Texas. There was actually a hearing last week based upon, not to read too many in the tea leaves, but based upon the questioning of the department by the judge. We are fairly optimistic that that ruling will go in our favor, and that could strike down that rule ahead of the Trump administration having to deal with that in the future administration. There's another question here about IFA supporting nominees that are friendlier to the franchise model. We have done that on both sides in the past. We've increasingly been one of the few business groups that's been willing to stick their neck out and support or oppose nominees for cabinet level positions or sub-regulatory positions. David Weil was probably the most prominent example of us, defeating a nominee. But I'd also remind you that we did support Marty Walsh for Secretary of Labor because of his track record of working across the aisle with the business community as mayor of Boston. And that really gave us a great seat at the table with the secretary, and I think limited some of the actions of the Biden Labor Department early on in this administration. However, when the president turned to Julie Su as his replacement for Marty Walsh, we again engaged in the debates. And while she ultimately ended up serving as an acting secretary, she was never confirmed by the U.S. Senate, I think in large part due to our willingness to stand in there. So we will support a nominee that's pro franchising. I mentioned a number of names. Both of those would obviously be great people to serve at the Labor Department. We've supported several nominees for FTC commissioner in the past. And so as names come forward, we will make a decision internally. And I will also make a pitch because I've been asked by people involved with the transition, if anybody in the franchise community is interested in serving in government. That is something that this incoming administration is looking for. They want business people to serve at various levels of government, both Senate confirmed and in other types of positions. So if there are folks that are interested and are subject matter experts, please reach out to me or members of the team. So I think that's it on the questions. Anna, if you want to put up our closing slide here, just as a reminder for folks to get registered for the IFA's convention coming up here in a few short months with the change in administration. We do have several speakers already confirmed that will help us, a couple weeks into the Trump administration and the new Congress make sense of, where things are at that point. We're bringing back Bruce Mehlman for those who were part of the IFA Advocacy Summit in September. I will also note that we do have commitment, although I'm not going to say by whom, from one of the FTC commissioners to come speak at the convention. So we're very excited about that. And of course, you'll be hearing from a lot of great IFA leaders. Danny Hughes, the president of Hilton Worldwide, is going to be in that CEO president slot, talking about the Hilton story and journey, and a lot of great award winners that we'll be recognizing at the IFA convention in February. So register early, save a couple bucks, and we look forward to having the biggest gathering in the franchise community in the new year. Thank you for joining us today, Kevin, Lori. Your insights are so great, and I appreciate the counsel you give to me and the team and the franchise community every single day. So thanks for spending an hour with us for your afternoon.
Thanks for having me.
Yep, great to be on.
All right. Thanks, guys. Have a great afternoon, everyone.